The Maunder Minimum and the Variable Sun-Earth Connection by Willie Weehawkson and Stephen H. Yaskell. A 323-page expose on natural climate variability, the effects on human populations, the effects on Earth, and what you're not being told. To interrupt his yellow plan, the sun does not allow. Caprices of the atmosphere, and even when the snow heaves balls of specks like vicious boy directly in his eye, does not so much as turn his head, busy with majesty. 'Tis his to stimulate the earth and magnetize the sea, and bind astronomy in place. Yet any passing by would deem ourselves the busier, as the minutest bee that rides amidst a thunder, a bomb to justify. Emily Dickinson, poem 224. Since people are by nature poorly equipped to register any but short-term changes, it is not surprising that we fail to notice slower changes in either climate or the sun. John A. Eddy, The New Solar Physics, 1977 to 78. In this time of global warming, we are impelled by both the anticipated dire consequences and the scientific curiosity to investigate the factors that drive the climate. Climate has fluctuated strongly and abruptly in the past, with ice ages and interglacial warmings, as we can see here. Long-term extremes, in other words. Historical research in the last decades has shown short-term climate transients to be frequent occurrences, often imposing disastrous hardships on the afflicted human populations. In the 17th century of North America, Europe, and China, it provides an outstanding example of the onset of cold. The principal impact is on agriculture, the food supply, particularly near the northern limits. Famine begets social and political turmoil, as well as pestilence and death. It is as important to appreciate the social impact of the transient cold as it is to understand the cause of this cold. The onset of warm periods have a comparable destructive impact, but in other ways in other parts of the globe. For instance, the prolonged drought is what is now southwestern U.S. during the unusually warm 12th century, is now happening now. Now, recent studies of ice cores from drilling through Greenland, which you're looking at, occasionally show these strong transients. Now, the big ones are at the 100,000-year cycle. The last one just happened 12,000 years ago. Before that, 140, 240, 340, and so on. The mean temperature dropping a couple of degrees or more over a decade, followed closely by substantial reduction in atmospheric carbon dioxide. In such a cold snap initiated by a temporary disruption of the Gulf Stream, for instance, and if so, then what disrupted the Gulf Stream? And then, what did a worldwide reduction in surface seawater temperatures consume the missing atmospheric carbon dioxide? Is that what happened? We may expect that there is no single cause driving a downturn in temperature or driving the present upturn. The measured rapid increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere through the second half of the 20th century is largely a consequence of profligate burning of fossil fuels. We can only conclude that the greenhouse effect of the accumulating carbon dioxide and other anthropogenic emissions may have a warming effect. Now, while anthropogenic aerosols may push a little in the opposite direction, there is the confusion. It leaves people wondering about the comparable warming through the first half of the century when the accumulation of carbon dioxide was slow and slight. There we turn to the inconsistent sun. And that's what this entire paper is about. The history of the scientific detective work that has led to the present partial understanding of the brightening sun since about 1880 is fascinating. The work really got underway with the invention of the telescope in 1610 and extends through the ongoing contemporary studies of atmospheric physics and of solar and stellar variability. It's fair to say that the scientific inquiry thus far has established the enormous complexity, the 20th century warning problem. The two major drivers appear to be the varying brightness of the sun and, of course, the accumulating greenhouse gases. The latter, we know, is nonsense. These are imposed on the diverse dynamical modes of circulation of the terrestrial atmosphere and the oceans. Indeed, it has been proposed by some that the decadal and even century-long cycles, like the AMO you're looking at here, swings the climate variability. And it might be nothing more than a natural consequence of non-stable nodes of atmospheric circulation. That is to say, that the climate cannot settle down because there is no truly stable mode in which it to settle. Climate is highly variable, no matter at what level you look at it. This view may be perhaps too simple, but it makes the important point that the wandering and never stable climate is hypersensitive to both external and internal stimuli. The slight deflection by a small tweak may divert the atmosphere into a diverging dynamical path. Snowball Earth. Runaway global warming. We would not go so far as to apply the popular saw from chaos theory that the fluttering of a butterfly in the rainforest, you know, the butterfly effect, so what we're saying is that the fluttering of a butterfly in the rainforest of the Amazon basin may ultimately strongly influence rain at David Dubine's Tennessee farm. We reject the applicability of this vivid overstatement for the simple reason that the atmosphere is buffeted so much more strongly by other effects. For instance, the eruption of Mount Pinatubo represents a butterfly of a much greater vigor than any Amazonian lepidopteron, which simply means butterfly. However, we cannot escape the fact that seemingly small effects may, by their special nature, ultimately lead to large consequences. Thus, in our search to understand the climatic changes, long term, past and present, we should not immediately reject any exotic idea, as absurd as it may seem, until we can be sure that we fully understand the sensitive atmosphere that we live in. And it is quite sensitive. And that full understanding of the dynamical atmosphere, with its 3D hydrodynamics, cloud formation, coupling to the dynamic ocean circulation currents, coupling to the mountain topography, that lies many years in the future. Thus, we must give consideration to a variety of unsubstantiated and even dubious ideas. We must keep in mind the absence of understanding of an effect is not the same thing as understanding that the effect cannot be. Now, many current ideas will ultimately prove to be false or inaccurate, especially global warming. Just as many old ideas have already fallen by the wayside. One of the most frustrating aspects of the origins of climate variation is the intermittent nature of some of the effects, up and down and in and out. And the fact that we can't explain them as of yet, but we're trying to. An example of this sometimes solar correlation of the formation of troughs at the 100 millibar level over the North Pacific, the effect appears to come and go with the varying surface seawater temperatures through El Nino and La Nina. Or are we just kidding ourselves and there's really no connection with solar activity? Then what can we say about the once well-established but now long vanished correlation of the level of Lake Rudolph, now Lake Turkana, with the solar sunspot cycle? Drought in the high prairie in the western U.S. in association with the deep sunspot minimum that occurs every hail cycle, or 22 years, every 2 cycles. Seems now to be statistically robust effect, but the physical connection remains mysterious. So what are we to think? Do we know what's going on? Well, I think we're getting there. Heinrich Svensmark has recently pointed out the remarkably close correlation between cloud cover and the cosmic ray intensity. The cloud experiment at CERN proved this, so there's no argument. Cosmic rays cause increased cloud cover at mid-latitudes. The connection here would presumably be through the nucleation of aerosols, water drops, the ice crystals, and by the atmospheric ions created by the passage of cosmic ray particles. If this effect is real, which, quote unquote, has been proven by CERN, then what are we to expect? What are we to think? It represents a highly leveraged control on climate from outside of our system. Unfortunately, we don't know enough about physics and chemistry of cloud formation to pass judgment at this time. Except everything Heinrich Svensmark has said has come true. And CERN went out to prove him wrong, and they proved him right. So there's that. Then, to what extent does the temperature of the upper stratosphere influence the dynamics of the jet stream in the troposphere? And what effects did the sun have on that dynamic? The wavy jet stream we've seen has become more meridional as opposed to zonal. What say you? Progress in understanding cloud formation, the global dynamics of the atmosphere and oceans, the quantitative ocean atmospheric carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, and other things will eventually clear way to the rubbish and leave the gems. However, there does need to be a lot of lab work and observations in the field before this will be possible. The worst mistake a scientist can make is to assert prematurely that some exotic new effect cannot be, because our present limited knowledge does not cover the effect. And that's what's happening currently in global warming nonsense science. Certainly some ideas are without a known physical basis at the present time. They should be a catalog under some such heading as curious idea, presently dubious, to be kept clearly in mind as the science progresses. And that's what we call science. And currently that's very infrequently happening. Now, the history of ideas on terrestrial climate and weather change and the history of ideas on the magnetic activity of the sun can be traced back to ancient times. And we do that by researching petroglyphs. Some of the historical interpretations of the observations brings smiles to our faces today. But it must be remembered, the interpretation is the first essential step in setting up the possibility of negation, the crucial step in any scientific investigation. And we've been doing that quite well on the channel. And here's a really good piece of data that is the negation of anthropogenic global warming. Check out the UAH satellite-based temperature of the global lower atmosphere in March. It's below baseline, which goes back to the average temperature in the 1980s. Now, if we're in some catastrophic global warming and the current global Earth temperature is the same as it was back in 1983, it's even lower than that. How are we catastrophically warming? That's 4 decades ago. That's nonsense, in my opinion. Now, the effort to establish a coherent body of knowledge of climate variation and solar activity variation has been fascinating and protracted. A connection between the two has been speculated off and on for at least a couple of centuries, but has become very hot in the last few years. Ding, ding. But only with the concept of quantitative statistical correlations has it been possible to make serious progress. And only with the advance of physics and technology has it been possible to pursue the actual mechanism. There is no single point in time when the science of the connection got underway. But the modern phase, the connecting the global climate with activity in the sun, was initiated by E. Walter Maunder just a little more than a century ago. Maunder's principal contribution was to emphasize the varying level of solar activity over centuries. There's our glorious sun there. Since the advent of the telescope, with particular attention to the scarcity of sunspots from about 1645 to 1715, beginning only 35 years after the start of telescopic observations, Maunder points was conveniently ignored or even denied because no one knew what it meant. Now, fortunately, Jack Eddy took up the historical investigation 30 years ago and turned up enough old records that the reality of the Maunder minimum was established beyond any reasonable doubt in the scientific community. Subsequent historical research has unearthed detailed systematic records of sunspot numbers, which show how peculiar the behavior of the sun was during this time. Then, without modern data on the atmospheric production rate of carbon-14 by cosmic rays, Eddy went on to show that such prolonged periods of solar inactivity have occurred 10 times in the last 7,000 years. So, what may we anticipate? Well, that there will be yet another Maunder minimum in the future. Yes, and here's the graphical analysis of the Sporer, Maunder, Dalton, and the centennial minimum. So we anticipate that there will be yet another Maunder minimum in the future. Finally, Eddy showed that the mean annual temperature in the northern temperate zone exhibits a remarkable tendency to track the general level of solar activity, meaning, in layman's terms, that the solar activity directly is corresponding to the temperature on Earth in the northern hemisphere. And that set the stage for contemporary research into the sun-climate connection, which has been denied by mainstream all the way up till today. It's even been blocked on YouTube and other platforms. Global warming has turned attention to the sun-climate connection as part of the general warming process. At the same time, the superposition of the two effects of accumulating greenhouse gases and the brighter or more active sun has rendered the scientific problem of studying either aspect much more difficult. Until now, because now the sun is shutting down and the temperature is going down and not going up. So all eyes are on the solar climate variability paleoclimatologists. Because we've been right all along. Are you picking it up? The superposition of the two effects of accumulating greenhouse gases and the brighter, more active sun has rendered the scientific problem of studying either impossible. The consequences of greenhouse gases and solar variability are not readily separated. And that's what we're trying to do as independent contractors on climate science. I mean, we don't have any sponsors. We're doing this for the benefit of humanity. So science is really advancing quite quickly in recent times. As already noted, an immense amount of laboratory and field work will have to be done if we are to disentangle and understand the complex responses of the atmosphere as it relates to cosmic rays and cloud formation, stratospheric aerosols coming from increased volcanic activity during this grand solar minimum, and the fact that all science is based on climate denial, and the fact that there's natural climate variability, and that humans are not the driver of climate. Meanwhile, we are in an exciting position, perhaps a little too exciting. If we stop to think about it, and just like, let's stop and let's think about it. I don't even know what's going to pop up there. It's dark, but it was important. Let's just look at this. If we stop to think about it, of living in the midst of a warming earth, which has ended, and now it's cooling the last 4 years. Perhaps a little too exciting. The social and economic impact has not even been touched upon. The first warning tremors being the international political and economic efforts to reduce emissions of carbon dioxide may actually, well, kill millions or hundreds of millions of people. And thereby will also slow the rate of increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And what NASA has shown in the last few decades is the increasing carbon dioxide has been beneficial to Earth. The actual planet is greening. Optimum CO2, based on a paleoclimatological standpoint, is between 500 and 800 parts per million. And we're not even in that zone. And yet, the powers that be want to reduce that lower than it is today, because we're all going to die. It's insane. The enhanced carbon dioxide promises enhanced crop yields. But that seems a small gain when compared to the uncontrolled risks by which our society has associated it with, which are all completely fabricated. It's the 21st century, for goodness sakes. And if we can't pull our heads out of our asses at this point, I don't know where we're going to go. But this is simply the foreword of the paper on the expose that we're going to bring to you on the Maunder minimum in the coming days. This is the foreword. The first 2 pages of 323 pages of information. So, buckle up, kids. It's going to get real. Hope you got something out of the video. Proper prior planning prevents piss poor performance. As we have just finished the first of a 10-part series on the Maunder minimum and the variable Sun-Earth connection. Be safe. We love you. Leave your questions below, and we will answer every single one of them. That's how we roll. Click on one of the other boxes to gain more knowledge. And be safe.